Welcome back to my channel. And today I'm so glad that we have Professor Darcy Harris with us today. So Darcy is a professor in the Department of Thanatology in King's University College at Western University, which is located in Canada, Ontario, Canada. And so Darcy, welcome.
Hi, thank you, Chia-Ying. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Yeah, so Darcy and I met because our good friend Greg Samuelson, who is in the field of compassion focused therapy, kind of connected us. And Darcy does a lot of work on grief and compassion focused therapy. And so when Darcy is working on this book about compassion focused therapy approach to address grief, I was very honored to be invited to contribute to a chapter that's talking about how hoarding and grief actually can be connected. And so that's how we met. And so that's also how I started to learn more about Darcy's work, especially around grief, how you work with people who are going through grieving process. And and I also know that Darcy also has an expertise in death anxiety. So would you like to tell us a little bit about both?
Hmm. I can start with the death anxiety part. Um, I see death anxiety in a couple of different ways. The first way is obviously personal death anxiety that I think a lot of people experience or they have, and they often, I think, address that anxiety by trying to avoid things that have to do with death, including sometimes people who are experiencing grief after the death of a loved one or had a significant loss. We're in a culture that's both death obsessed, because if you look at TV programs and streaming and the things that are in popular media, they have themes of death all in them, but it's like we watch that vicariously. So we have that fascination, while at the same time we have the avoidance where we don't talk about it with people who are close to us. Most people don't have a will. Most people don't talk to their close loved ones about what they would want to have done with their body after they died, or their funeral plans. It all happens when someone dies. Everybody has to jump in and make these plans very quickly because we tend to avoid these types of conversations. So that's on the one hand. And then I think what I find really fascinating on the other hand is more of a collective death anxiety. In CFT terminology, we'd call it the threat response, but I think a collective response to feeling threatened, which I really think in North America, the events of 9/11, 2001, changed the psyche of people, not just in the United States, but also Canada. We were very close to New York, Canada, and the events that happened there. We experienced a feeling of fear and threat and terror like we had never had before. And I do think that made a major change in just the psyche collectively of people who reside in not just the United States, but also in Canada. And I think that response has led to different issues and trends that have happened both politically and sociologically as well. Trying to integrate the sense of we could die at any time, and the deaths that we watched on television and the trauma that we experienced as a result of that has left a really lasting hold, I think, on people's feelings of vulnerability. And that's really what death anxiety is about, is acknowledging vulnerability and unpredictability in life. We don't do that well.
Right. Well, while you are sharing these two forms of death anxiety, I'm just reflecting on how this is so present in the population that I work with that are struggling with hoarding. So when you're talking about the anxiety or the taboo of talking about personal death or thinking about that, but on the other hand, it's like the anxiety and the fear is always there. And I'm just thinking about like some of the clients that I'm working with that are older, and they are not that old, but they are facing some kind of like health issues,
Yeah.
right? And so they are talking about how their items, that what's going to happen to their items, their personal belongings when they pass. And it's like even kind of like the fear there of like, if I preserve my stuff, somehow I'm holding on to my life.
Mhm.
So it's not like the people have explicitly said that, but it kind of like it's a sense there, like my stuff is my life and it's my legacy, and
Mhm.
how am I going to make the best representation of who I am when I was living. And so that there's a lot of attachment toward the personal possessions. So that's kind of like speaking to the personal death anxiety. And on the other hand, there's this collective like sense of like, I just don't feel safe. I feel like anything, anytime can happen that's dangerous and bad. So that anxiety about the collective safety and threat. And so a lot of times I feel like people are holding on to these very concrete objects, and almost as a way to cope with this like big unknown, big uncertainty, just a very intangible sense of threat and fear. Like somehow holding on to those objective things is like coping with that.
I really appreciate you describing this. I was saying earlier that I do have a private practice. I am a clinician as well, and my practice specializes in people with issues related to loss and grief and more complicated types of loss. And I would imagine I probably have clients who do hoard, who do save things and have difficulties parting, but they don't bring it forward in therapy. They don't usually make it known to me in therapy, and I think there's a lot of shame that surrounds that. And I would certainly want to honor the purpose that this is serving for clients, rather than try to shame them into, you need to get rid of your stuff, because these things, like you said, they're imbued with parts of that person, and they're serving a real purpose. I always look at the phrase, this is from a book I read by Donna Markova, what's right about what's wrong. To
Mm-hmm.
really look at, this is not what's wrong with you. This is your way of trying to cope, of trying to process the events in your life that have happened.
Right.
When you were talking about, people thinking about, health issues and facing maybe the end of their own lives, we talk about a term called symbolic immortality, that
Mm-hmm.
we do imbue the things around us as extensions of ourselves that live on after we are gone. You think about treasured pieces of jewelry that go from one family generation to the next, and you're holding a piece of your great aunt or your great grandparents, or even their great you're holding a piece of them
Mm-hmm.
in this item.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a piece of symbolic immortality that we pass down that has meaning, and all grief is searches for meaning. And I think that's the real process of grief.
Mm-hmm.
And we gravitate towards places that will help us to feel protected or soothed when we feel anxious.
Mm-hmm.
So whether or not it's directly that we're completely aware of it, there are some researchers that say we have death anxiety all the time, we just don't have it in our conscious awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to some extent, some of their research is quite compelling. I tend to use the words threat versus death anxiety, because I think the sense of threat and the feeling of threat is what fosters, some of the difficulties that people experience along the way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate that. Yeah. Thank you for making the connection between the coping and the object. Like that's like a way of coping,
Mhm.
right? So that makes me wonder that in your work, especially when you are working with somebody who is so afraid of this, the personal safety like threat, because it just feels like nothing will really soothe that, right? Like death is kind of like our ultimate fear. So it kind of like it's so big. How do you help clients to feel like comfortable enough to even look at the fear?
I don't start by saying, oh, hi, let's put all this in front of you and look at your fear big time. I think they'd be out the door within 2 minutes.
Right.
I think you start gradually with grounding and becoming, feeling a sense of safety with yourself, feeling grounded with yourself, feeling a sense of accepting, yourself. And that includes the anxiety that you can't control. That includes this really uncomfortable feeling that you carry. It's all there, and really, if we can sit with it, a lot of times it's trying to help us, trying to serve a purpose with us. But it's really hard to slow down and to learn how to be grounded in ourselves, because often when we slow down, that's when those thoughts come up.
Yeah.
And so with clients who are really anxious, I won't go into talk therapy really that right away. I will actually just ask them to do some breathing exercises with me, to maybe do some body work, just to help them feel grounded, feel safe. They get to know me as well, so hopefully they start to feel a sense of anchoring with me, that I am not here in any way to judge or to shame or to, I have no idea why this is happening, and I'm really more here to let you explore how to be safe and how to get what you need to decide how you want to then move forward. And if you choose to move forward and still keep the things that are in your life, it is your choice completely. There's nothing wrong or shameful about making a conscious choice. But if it's hindering you from living fully and not having the life you really want, then let's do that. Let's work on what is it that would happen so that you could then feel more at ease in your daily life.
Yeah, that's really resonating with me, that a lot of times we start using, a lot of times I feel like when we start talking, we go to the head, and
Yeah.
sometimes that's where the fear lives. So let's not go there yet. Let's come to our body and remember you have this being, this physical grounding being, like this animal here
Yeah.
that's grounding you, that you're not just here in your head fantasizing all of the catastrophize everything, all the scenario there that's make you very scared. But how about here and now? How are you feeling in your legs? How are you feeling in your body, in your chest? Let's be present. Let's come to this present moment. And then from there, we kind of go to the scary places.
And come back, because we know what coming back feels like. And that's so important. Our minds are wonderful things, and yet we can sit here having this podcast, and a part of our mind might be thinking going to the grocery store later and thinking about a conversation we had yesterday. And our minds have this ability to think in the forward future and also in the past at the same time. We're sitting in another place completely. And that can be really difficult, because you then you feel fragmented, and you kind of get taken away. So to be able to stay in this present moment, this is the place where I'm safe, or I'm grounded, or I can come back to this, is like your secure base you can come back to. But learning how to do that, and it's different for each person. It's not always the same for each person. I have some clients that do that through art, or who may do it through an activity of sorts. I have sand trays in my office, which I don't use symbolically. I let people just put their hands in the sand and just feel the sand, because the tactile sense brings them into this present moment. Not everybody's comfortable doing breathing exercises. So you really have to, you and the client kind of explore what feels best in this moment, and try to build on that. I do use what used to be called Jacobson's relaxation with my clients. I will suggest some really good recordings of that. It's progressive relaxation, especially at night before they go to bed, when they're not feeling, like they can ground themselves even in the car or something, that they develop a habit of doing a progressive relaxation. So the focus then becomes not on the mind racing, but on the body being right here and feeling the strength of the body and in that moment. So I use that quite a bit with my clients.
That's great. It's called progressive
Progressive muscle relaxation.
Okay.
And I actually have a couple of YouTube people have done some YouTube recordings. And it's really interesting. Clients have to like the voice. So I'll give them a suggestion and say, go look these up and find one where the voice seems right or the background seems good or the timing. Use what appeals to you, because I can remember me starting into mindfulness meditation. I was doing a series and it was recorded, and the voice of the person, and who's a really well-known meditation teacher, and I kept opening my eyes thinking, he's driving me crazy. His voice was just grating on me. So there's got to be, find what works for you. But that to me is a really good way that is accessible to everybody, and it's something you can go to and start to develop that habit that when you're racing, you feel the anxiety come on, you have a go-to thing that you can work with that doesn't involve your mind racing on with it as well.
That's great. That's great. So maybe I can put the name at the bottom of the YouTube channel, and then that way it's a reminder for people to Google it and find your cup of tea in terms of the kind of texture of the voice of
yes that'd be a good idea, I think. Thanks.
Yeah. So there are so many questions that I have for you, and I know that we kind of decided we're going to talk a little bit about death anxiety and also talk a little bit about grief. And it doesn't feel like the death anxiety topic is over yet, but
okay.
I think we can switch gear to more grief related things. And
one thing I'll add in for the death anxiety, the key is that it is anxiety, and it is about death, but it's something you still have to be gentle with when you're approaching, and you really need to be thinking, what am I trying to accomplish here when you're with somebody who's very anxious, because the real need when somebody's anxious is feeling safe and feeling protected. And when we're feeling that sense of threat, that anxiety, we don't have the ability to embrace change. We don't have the ability to do something really super different, because automatically that activation of the threat system makes us pull in because it's trying to protect. And we don't have the ability to think expansively about things. And I think that's what also gets behind sometimes people feeling threatened by people who don't look like them, or who don't have the same values as them. And because when you're feeling anxious and you got the sense of threat activated, you're in your corner, and you're kind of taking a defensive stance, and there's not room to let in something that doesn't fit, because you don't have that ability to open. You're really closed and protected for a reason. So I think it's normalizing some of these experiences that we've had, especially around COVID, and the threat that people have experienced around getting sick or not, or masks or not, or vaccines or not. These become very big issues, and I think it's because of the sense of anxiety and threat people have felt that's been very strong across the board.
Right. And I think as you're speaking, it feels like when we call it death anxiety, but it's not strictly only about the dying that we are anxious about. It's like you said, it's about the threat. And also that there are so many symbolic deaths. There can be like identity death, or there can be like ending of a relationship. That's also a form of death.
The death of a relationship where the two people keep living, but the relationship is what dies, or the death of your hopes and dreams, or the death of your future as you once thought it was going to be. The death of a dream for your child when your child is diagnosed with a condition that will follow them for the rest of their lives. So these are non-death losses, but they are still they're still related to that sense of loss and threat and grief. So I think of death loss as part of a conglomeration of all types of loss. They all trigger grief, because what grief is really is a sense of our world as we've once known, and our attachment system just gets all jumbled up, and that leaves us feeling really vulnerable and really anxious. And that's the grieving process helps us to rebuild all of that, and it's a painstaking process.
Mhm.
But they're very related, and I do not see the difference between grief over the death or ending of a relationship versus the loss of a husband or wife or spouse through death.
Right.
They both trigger the same type of response inside of us. They both lead us to feeling very vulnerable, very
Mhm.
threatened, and they both trigger grief as well.
That's kind of like what I'm seeing in the population who experience hoarding too.
Mhm.
Sometimes that it's kind of really hard to help clients kind of identify the loss or what are they grieving about. It's like, no, my life is fine, nobody had died. And like, well, it's not like they cannot pinpoint like what they are supposed to be grieving about, and why are they holding on to these items as if there's a lot of fear and anxiety of loss. Yeah, and so sometimes kind of like there will be kind of like a light bulb moment. Some clients will say, oh, I guess I'm grieving the life that could have been, or maybe I'm grieving that like my who I was when I was doing a certain job, or who I could have been, or like a sense of like I didn't live my life fully, kind of like a sense of regret.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so even that coming to that realization of, oh, there was loss there, that can take a whole big chunk of the healing journey to come to that realization.
I agree. And um, I think too, we tend to have what we call hierarchies of loss, that we think some losses are worse than others, but we
Mm,
never know. I mean, for some people, the experience of one type of loss may really be overwhelming, but to another person, it's like, oh, it's just okay, it's a disappointment. So
right.
this is where this idea that we have a rating system of this loss really deserves this and this loss doesn't, or this is nothing, but it's not ours to judge, and we sometimes do that to ourselves. We self disenfranchise our grief because it's really inconvenient. I'd really rather not be grieving if I can help it. So if I can diminish this and convince myself it doesn't matter, then I will be much better faster. And that's not exactly how it works, but it's a good try. We do try. um, so I think opens up a range of things to think about, but I can never decide for you what is a significant loss for you. You're the only one that knows that really hit you hard, that's really knocked you off your feet. And you're the only one who can say, yeah, that really did that to me. I can't say that for you, or I can't assume a loss should be devastating for you when you actually were able to accommodate it quite well given your own coping skills. So it's hard because we do have this judgment by others and on ourselves about what really is valid to grieve and what isn't.
Right,
Those are these internalized social norms that we have that don't really serve us that well, I don't think.
right.
Yeah, the grief doesn't go away. It just kind of what we call goes underground.
Right,
And so it's not so visible on the surface, but it doesn't go away.
right. Yeah. And that's kind of related to what I was thinking about yesterday about asking you, that that it's grief is so subtle, and even the identification of loss is so subtle and so hard. So sometimes like it's almost like it's very good at camouflage itself. Like it's like you look like you are angry, or you look like you are like doing a lot of activities. And it can look so differently for different people and different contexts.
Yeah.
So like how do you smell that there's grief there? And
You sniff it out. No. Um, Um, and you're right there, I think we're used to also grief being a certain way, that grief is all about sadness. And that may not necessarily be the case. There are many of my clients who grieve through their anger.
Mhm.
They grieve through somatic, body symptoms.
Right.
They can't focus, or existentially, they just feel like, what is my life now? What is life really about? They have this existential sense of what has happened, or even for people who have a belief in God, that sometimes it's like, I don't get this. This does not fit into my knowledge of God as a benevolent creator. So, I think this is where we get into trouble too. Not only number one, deciding what's worthy of grief, but number two, acknowledging the many shapes of grief that manifest and the ways that it can come forward.
Right.
So I think I see more clients angry than I do sad. But
Mm,
I always think of anger as the dog with its back up, don't mess with me, back off.
mm,
And how I experience that with people is I've had enough. I can't take any more.
mm,
Just back off. I've had it. And not a personal sense of anger towards me necessarily, but anger that just is protective. That's the real function of each of these emotions. And it's
yeah.
a very protective function. It makes a lot of sense when you think of grief as a form of anxiety or distress. We're trying to protect ourselves. We can't take anything else on.
Right. Right. Well, that makes me thought of like when I was writing the book chapter about how grief and hoarding are like related, and I was remembering a lot of cases or a lot of examples that I've seen clinically. It's almost like you said that don't come close, or like it's kind of digging in the heels, like I am not going to admit that this thing is lost. Don't make me face that.
Yeah.
I'm gonna hold on to all these things, and I'm not even gonna think about anything internally. I'm just gonna try to numb myself or try to distract myself, and or try not look into that box of maybe it's a box of belongings of people who have passed away from their lives. I'm just not gonna do that. It's like digging in the heels. Don't
Okay.
push.
But for me as a therapist, and you also as a therapist, if somebody comes into my office, there's a reason they come into my office. And so, that's what I want to honor. And it's not like right away I'd say, well, let's deal with the sporting issue of yours. My question is, where would you like to start?
Mm-hmm.
And I think people could have their own wisdom and they can decide where they need to start. And if the hoarding is something that's part of that,
Right.
then we don't just focus on that. We focus on the bigger picture, and they can choose what they want to do,
Exactly.
about hoarding or not. And it's ultimately their life. And, my job is to respect those choices
Mm-hmm.
and to help them to find their own voice, to help them to feel a greater sense of joy in life.
Mm-hmm.
But not by addressing things that they don't want to address or that don't seem relevant to them at that moment.
Right, right. That is totally agreed. Yeah. A lot of times I say that hoarding is not about the stuff. The
Yeah.
stuff is just a manifestation of a heart that is hurting or suffering. So let's not even talk about the stuff. Let's talk
Right.
about you as a person.
Yeah.
If we come to this realization that actually the stuff really doesn't bother me, it really doesn't get in the way of living a liberated and fulfilling life, then why do we bother dealing with your stuff?
Yeah.
Like, we
That's
care
right.
about you as a person.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly would be my approach as well. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, and I think some clients, probably come into our offices and they're worried that we're going to focus and zero on this one thing that makes their anxiety feel worse. And they might just because they've consciously chosen to come to an office to talk about something.
Mhm.
But I think pretty quickly it feels like, oh, okay, I'm in control of this process. I'm here to explore. And my job as a therapist is you came into my office. How can I best honor this time with you? How can I best meet you where you feel you need to be?
Yeah.
And we go from there. And I kind of talk about they're the lead because it's their life. They're the one that's the expert in their own life.
Right.
But they are coming in, and if they wouldn't come in for therapy, if there wasn't something they wanted to discuss, if there
Right.
wasn't something that maybe didn't feel just right. And so I'm not going to capitalize on that in a bad way. I'm just going to say, okay, you came here, let's honor that desire.
Right. Right. Hmm. Well, we kind of come to the end of the interview here, but there's a question that I thought would probably be kind of like a good last question.
Okay.
And I know that grief looks and works so differently from people to people. And the grieving process or the healing of the grieving process is also going to be very different for people, different people. So I wonder if you can say something about kind of like, what is it that in this healing of grief, or what is it in this process of grief that we are leading to? Is it like a liberation of life, or like what does it look like?
Yeah, do we use the word recovery? No. Do we use the word resolved? No. And there are no stages, and no, that's the hard part about grief, is you can't plot it out per se. What is my hope? I think of grief as representing a rip in a beautiful tapestry. And the fabric, the rip is there, and there's no denying it. So what we're trying to do is find a way to reweave the tapestry back together, but knowing as we do that, it'll never look the exact same as it did before. That you're weaving it together so the person can venture out and live again. But that loss is always now going to be a part of who they are. Ask any bereaved parent. I mean, pretty much anybody who's had a very significant loss, they will go back to this and say, there was a point in time my life completely changed from that moment forward. It might be an injury that ends your ability to compete, or it might be the ending of a job that was your identity as well, or the death of a child. The fabric got ripped. And so I think in therapy, I see it as a reweaving back together the fabric so that you can still hold and work, but in a way that is different, because it's not going to ever be the same. There's a beautiful practice you might be familiar with that it's gaining popularity here in the West, but kintsugi, are you familiar with the practice? So this was a Japanese practice originally that I had been told of, that you take shards of broken pottery, like you have a bowl that's broken, right? And instead of just using super glue and putting it back together, you actually put gold flecking into the glue to highlight the brokenness. And you put it back together, and the patterns are really beautiful and intricate, but it also will hold sustenance again, because it becomes a bowl, but it will never be the same bowl that it was before. So can we find a way to hold life again, even though it's going to be different than how we ever did it before?
Right. And how can we enjoy and appreciate that difference?
I've had so many of my clients come in and say they've deepened, their awareness of others has grown. Their belief in themselves, they can't believe how strong they actually have been. They're parts of themselves they never knew existed before, in a good way. Just like the phoenix rising from the ashes. I hear that far more often than I hear I continue to be broken, and I'm just broken. That's usually how I hear people in the beginning, and then gradually I hear them say, I'm starting to think about life again. And that's my goal, because we can't undo what has happened, but we find ways to integrate what's happened into how we then, what we call the now what. This is now what. Now what life? Now what are my choices? Now what do I want? How can I be in the world now?
I love it. Yeah. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation with you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much again for taking the time to have a chat with me.
Chia-Ying, thank you very much for inviting me. I really look forward to this podcast and to learning more. I think this is a really important area, and hopefully it will be helpful to many, many people. So best wishes to you as well.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.